Covering nearly 600 acres of land, the Apshawa Preserve is one of the largest nature reserves in New Jersey and is under 50 miles from New York City. It's a popular escape for those hoping to leave the bustle of the city for a more relaxing atmosphere. The protection of the New Jersey Conservation Foundation has allowed the area to flourish with oak and maple trees, along with a great diversity of animal and bird species. One of the largest inhabitants of this reserve is the black bear, and their numbers are on the rise as their numbers creep towards 2,500 individuals. These bears are considerably smaller and less aggressive than their brown cousins and are less likely to cause a conflict and will usually stay within their own territory. Unfortunately, as their habitat has slowly increased in popularity as a hiking destination, more and more people have entered their habitat with little to no awareness of the danger they are putting themselves in. Darsh Patel was a 22-year-old student who was studying technology and informatics at Rutgers University. On September 21, 2014, Darsh and 4 friends decided to go hiking on the Apshawa Preserve. They had all individually visited the preserve in the past and were avid nature enthusiasts, so they were all pretty confident in their own abilities. After packing their bags full of their essentials, they set off the next day using various park and trail maps. They began hiking at 8 a.m. that morning and traveled along the first loop of the trail, taking photos with their cell phones of their surroundings and any animals that they encountered along the way. They were able to capture some images of the deer that grazed in the nearby fields, safe in the knowledge that the deer fences would keep anything off of their paths. They were mistaken. There were some unprotected areas, and certain predators knew exactly how to take advantage of these weak spots. As the group was finishing the first loop, one of the boys suddenly shouted out that he could see a large black bear creeping the ledge in the distance. Excitedly, they all turned to the ledge that he was pointing at, but they couldn't see anything, as the bear had already run off. Someone suggested that they should go back to the ledge to try and get a closer look at the animal, but the others decided that it wouldn't be smart to risk getting close to a bear that they could no longer see. It could be anywhere, after all. Instead, they continued to hike further down the trail, keeping an eye out for another possible bear sighting and hoping that this time they'd be able to capture the animal within their camera lens. As the track became a little more unkept, the group were forced to enter the unfenced areas of the park. Excited about the potential of capturing a bear on camera up close, they entered the fields in the unfenced part of the park. They were taken aback by how stunning the sights were, marveling at the beauty of the Butler Reservoir and the rolling green landscape around them. After walking for 7 hours, they decided to take a short break. They reassessed their plan and decided to continue to the connector loop, which was mostly unfenced. They climbed up a ledge to eat their snacks of granola bars while they rested for about half an hour before continuing their hike. Suddenly, Darsh spotted the black bear that his friend had seen earlier, only this time it was much closer and staring straight at him. Darsh froze and stared back at the 300-pound bear as it looked him up and down. Excitedly, he began to slowly raise his camera to capture the image of the animal only 100 yards away. Instead of being worried he'd be attacked, he was instead concerned about missing out on a photo. He was convinced that the animal would be scared of him, giving him the advantage. Darsh's friends spotted the bear as well, but they started to realize that the bear was slowly creeping towards them, seemingly beginning its hunt. The boys became worried and wanted to leave, knowing that they wouldn't stand a chance. But Darsh remained in front of the bear, taking more and more pictures. His friends began to warn him that the bear was now stalking him, but he was too engrossed in his photography to notice or care. Suddenly, the bear began to pick up speed and quickly closed the 100-yard gap between itself and the boy, growling as it ran. All the boys ran away at the sight of this massive animal running at them, all except Darsh. He continued taking pictures, photographing the bear as it got closer and closer to him, and his friends screamed at him to leave and run with them. He was too engrossed in his photos to fully understand what was happening, until it was all too late. He finally realized that the bear was only 15 yards away and panicked. He turned on his heel and tried to run away at the last minute, but the bear was still behind him, running faster and faster. The boys separated and ran down different paths, hoping to confuse the bear so that it would stop pursuing them. It worked for a second, and the bear stopped in its tracks, wondering who to follow. But its eyes quickly caught sight of Darsh again, who was the farthest behind the group. Darsh had gained some significant distance from the bear while it stopped running, when suddenly the worst happened. He tripped on a rock and twisted his ankle while looking over his shoulder at the bear. He screamed in fear as he watched the bear continue its charge at him, knowing he had no chance of escape this time. The bear immediately closed the gap and pounced on Darsh, tearing into his body with his huge jaws. It bit down hard on his body, ripping skin and muscle from his face, torso, and arms. It grabbed him by the legs and began to drag him across the floor as blood began to saturate the dirt beneath him. The animal ferociously chewed into his body, leaving numerous cuts and bites all over him, trying to pull his limbs out of his body. He screamed in agony and called for his friends, but there was nothing they could do. They hadn't brought any bear spray, and playing dead was no longer an option, as he was soon to be dead anyways. He tried to push the bear off of him, but he stood no chance. The bear was too strong. Covered in dirt and his own blood, Darsh Patel died alone in the woods. The rest of the group were still running, scared out of their minds as they'd heard the anguished screams of their friend behind them. They were fairly certain that the bear had killed Darsh, but they didn't know if the bear would still continue after them once it was done. Once they had gotten far enough away and couldn't hear the crunching of an approaching bear, they phoned for the police to report Darsh as missing.
911, where's your emergency?
Hey, hello. I'm on Macoupin Road. It's 81 Macoupin Road. I believe I'm in West Milford or somewhere around there. We were hiking and we saw a bear, and we all started running, and it started chasing us. 2 of us are okay, 1 other person answered, but 2 were really close, and I'm scared out of my mind for them. I want to go back, but I'm hurt, and I don't know what to do.
You're hurt, you said?
Like, not badly. I just scraped my leg. It's nothing major, but I'm more worried about them. Can anyone get here anytime really soon, please?
Are you on a trail?
Yeah, we were on the trail.
Well, it's going to take them a while to get anywhere near you if you're on a trail.
A search party was quickly organized by West Milford police to find the young man, and they combed the area for 2 hours straight. Finally, they found the brutalized remains of Darsh Patel's body. It was hardly recognizable and completely covered in blood, body parts strewn across the trail. As the search team were observing the mess of the body before them, they suddenly heard rustling behind them as the bear emerged from the bushes. It was coming to collect its meal once again. Startled by the number of people in front of its food, it began to get aggressive with the men present, who were trying to shoo it away. The search team's shouts at the bear only further enraged the animal. Finally, for the safety of everyone, and to avenge the young college student, they shot and killed the ferocious beast, ending its reign of terror. They collected Darsh's body and returned it to the family, leaving them to grieve for their son who had died too soon. It was declared that the group had done nothing wrong and that the attack was unprovoked, but they believed that the attack may have happened because the animal was extremely hungry. Smelling the boys' granola snacks on the ledge, it began to approach them to get the food from them, ultimately killing Darsh in the process. Running also would have activated the animal's natural predatory instincts, which triggered it to chase the group. Ultimately, it was an unfortunate accident that resulted in the death of a young man with a bright future. After analyzing the bear, shreds of Darsh's clothes as well as his skin and blood was found inside the bear's stomach. Darsh's phone was also found near his body with bite marks on it. When police looked inside his phone, they found his terrifying final photos before death. This was Darsh's final photograph he took before being fatally mauled. The bear is seen running towards him at less than 20 feet away. It was shortly after this moment when Darsh Patel realized the seriousness of the situation. It was at this moment he decided to run. Less than 5 minutes later, he met his horrifying final affliction. Wild animals are always fascinating, from rare species of birds to the sight of a truly magnificent beast such as a lion. There is simply something that captures our attention with these creatures and has us wanting to know more about them. However, there are some animals that fascinate us more than others. And what could be more intriguing than a creature which has changed very little since prehistoric times? With their razor-sharp teeth and almost prehistoric-like eyes, alligators truly are one of the world's most wondrous creatures. But much like their ancestors before them, they are also incredibly dangerous, something Cynthia Covert failed to realize. 58-year-old Cynthia Covert lived in Johns Island in South Carolina in the United States of America. She was a nail artist and had worked in her profession for many years. The woman loved to spend her days gossiping with her clients over the latest celebrity news or offering them advice for any problems that they might have been facing. Overall, it seemed like Cynthia was living a fairly normal life with a fairly normal routine, which she found comfort in. However, in 2020, something happened worldwide which no one was prepared for. A virus spread through the world, causing chaos in its wake, which led to people all over the world finding themselves suddenly uprooted from their normal daily routine and thrust into unknown circumstances, which left them feeling unsure of what to do next. Sadly, Cynthia was one of these people who suddenly found herself unemployed. Because a health crisis was declared, her salon was forced to shut its doors, and Cynthia was left with no source of income and with no clue when her salon would be able to open up again. Deciding that she wasn't going to simply sit around and wait for all of her savings to run out, Cynthia began to see some of her clients in their own homes. She thought that it would be a good way to earn a little bit of money whilst maintaining a form of social distancing. One of her clients was a woman named Barbara Howell, who lived on Kiowa Island. The Sea Islands, of which Kiowa and Johns Islands are a part of, are a chain of tidal and barrier islands on the Atlantic Ocean coast off of the southeastern United States. Being a series of various sized islands and being located near to the ocean, this means that there are various different animals which inhabit the waterways between each piece of land. One of these animals is the American alligator. This animal is the only crocodilian native to South Carolina. They can live up to 60 years and can grow over 13 feet in length. It was once listed as a federally endangered species due to hunting and encroachment onto their habitat. However, populations have rebounded, and the alligator's status has been upgraded from endangered to threatened. In fact, populations of alligators in South Carolina have done so well in terms of increasing their numbers that officials decided to instigate a hunting season back in 2008 to try and keep the population under control. On the day that Cynthia went to Barbara's house to do her nails for her, there was one of these alligators resting in the pond in the backyard of the home. Thinking nothing of it at first, Cynthia and her client settled down on the porch in the backyard where the nail artist began to do her job and shape Barbara's nails the way that she wanted them. However, from the very moment that Cynthia walked through the front door, Barbara felt as if there was something off with the woman's behavior. The 58-year-old woman seemed to be very talkative that particular day, and she was acting a bit strange as well. Barbara then went on to clarify that usually Cynthia would act very professionally whilst she was at the salon. But when she turned up to her home that day, the woman was acting very relaxed and excited as she told Barbara all about her boyfriend and how he was traveling from Tennessee to visit her. Whilst doing Barbara's nails, Cynthia also had a glass of wine, although Barbara couldn't be sure if the woman had potentially consumed a stronger substance before turning up at her home, as she simply thought that Cynthia's behavior was too out of the ordinary for her to be completely sober. However, seeing as the nail artist hadn't done anything besides talk a bit more than usual, Barbara decided to carry on with her appointment, under the impression that Cynthia would simply go back home once she was done and hopefully sleep off whatever was affecting her. However, little did Barbara know what would actually happen only moments later. After finishing off her client's nails, Cynthia once again looked over to the pond, only to notice that the alligator was still there. She became fascinated with the creature and decided that she wanted to get a closer look at it. So, whilst Barbara cleaned up the porch from the remnants of her nail appointment, Cynthia began walking over to where the alligator was resting in the pond. The 58-year-old took out her phone and began taking photos of the animal, trying to get the best possible image that she could. With every picture that Cynthia took, she inched ever closer to the alligator and the edge of the pond. Upon noticing where her friend had disappeared off to and how close to the dangerous animal she had gotten, Barbara quickly called out to her to back away from the alligator, as it had snatched a deer from the exact spot that she was standing only a few days previously. Scoffing, Cynthia apparently replied to Barbara, telling her that she wasn't a deer, before the nail artist then tried to touch the deadly reptile. In the next few moments, everything seemed to happen in a blur. Having seen what Cynthia was about to do, Barbara's husband had charged out of the house to try and grab the woman before it was too late. However, within seconds, the alligator had turned and snapped its jaws around Cynthia's left leg and had begun to drag her into the pond. Shocked at what was happening, Barbara had let out a horrified scream. However, oddly, Cynthia apparently didn't make a sound even as the alligator dragged her into the water and clamped down on her leg. Hearing the commotion, one of Barbara's neighbors ran over to the house to see what was going on. Upon witnessing the scene, the neighbor then grabbed a rope from his house, which he threw into the pond for Cynthia to grab a hold of. By this point, the woman was waist deep in the water, and as she held onto the rope, which her friends were using to try and pull her to safety, she apparently spoke in a calm manner. "I guess I won't do this again." Sadly, try as they might, Barbara, her husband, and the neighbor simply weren't strong enough to break the alligator's hold on Cynthia's leg. Then, once the reptile was far enough out into the pond, it began going into a death roll. This is a maneuver in which a crocodile or alligator rolls over with its prey in its jaws to bring its prey underwater and drown it. With nothing else that they could do, Barbara called the emergency services. Within a few minutes, police deputies and firefighters arrived at Barbara's home, where they charged into the backyard in order to help in any way that they could. Initially, they saw no movement in the water from either the alligator or Cynthia, but after about 15 minutes, Cynthia's body resurfaced, with the alligator still holding on to her leg. Thinking quickly, one of the deputies shot the alligator, forcing it to release Cynthia. She was then quickly pulled to shore, where, thankfully, emergency service workers were able to see that her body was intact. However, she did have severe injuries to her left leg. By this time, paramedics had also arrived at the scene and quickly whisked Cynthia away to the hospital. Sadly, she was declared dead shortly after arriving at the hospital, with the initial cause of death being drowning. This sadly marked the third alligator-related death to have happened in South Carolina within 4 years. And whilst it is not known exactly why Cynthia was acting so strange that day and why she decided to approach a known deadly animal, her passing was still a tragedy, which greatly upset those who knew and loved her. It's important to remember that it is better to appreciate nature from a safe distance, as a wild animal could attack without notice, which could result in severe injury or, in the worst-case scenario, meeting your terrifying final affliction.
Our story today takes place in Bella Coola, a valley found in British Columbia, Canada. It stretches 80 kilometers and is known to be a very scenic and beautiful area, with a diverse landscape of meadows, forests, mountains, and rivers, as well as a long history of world-renowned craftsmanship. There really is something for everyone. As picturesque as this area may be, it is also situated in the Great Bear Rainforest, thusly named for its inhabitants, specifically many wild species of cougars, wolves, and of course, bears. But these bears are special. Although there are 1,400 grizzly bears living there, this area is home to a distinctive subspecies of black bear, the Kermode bear, also known as the spirit bear, as 1/10 of the cubs are born with the recessive gene causing a white coat of fur. As a result of its unique residence, the Great Bear Rainforest has been protected by the government of British Columbia since 2016 to stop industrial logging, meaning that 85% of the ancient forests will be kept safe. Given that the population of Bella Coola is only 2,100 people, there is approximately 1 bear to every 2 people in the area. Despite this, bear attacks have been very rare and they usually live side by side fairly peacefully. However, there is one incident that would change that forever. Jordan Carbery was a park ranger living in Bella Coola in 2018. He enjoyed his job, it was fairly easy, and he was able to work in such a beautiful place every day. On July 2nd, he was returning home after a lovely holiday with his friends to celebrate his 50th birthday. And as he approached his home, he saw 2 grizzly bears climbing a cherry tree nearby. This was not uncommon as the fruit on the trees were ripe, and bears are well-known cherry lovers and they actually help with the dispersion process for the trees. They seemed quite large, so Jordan assumed they were just typical adult bears searching for food and meant no harm, although he would rather they were further away from his house. He continued up his driveway to encourage them to leave his property, and they eventually took the hint, traipsing back into the forests. He didn't give the interaction a second thought as he was used to seeing bears all the time. He went to bed as soon as he got in. At 5 a.m. the next morning, he woke up and started to get ready as he usually did when something caught his eye out of the window. There was something moving behind the trees, and so he assumed it was the cherry-eating adult grizzlies from last night. He grabbed his camera and rushed downstairs, leaving the house to take photos that he thought he would later share with his friends. He was an avid photographer, and living in the beautiful place that he did meant that he was able to take amazing photos of his daily life. He figured that if he didn't spook the bears, they would ignore him and he could get some nice pictures of them eating the cherries. So he walked out into the forest, and 36 feet from his front door, he had a clear view of the bears in the tree. While he was watching the bears, one of them fell from the tree and suddenly something moved next to Jordan. He turned to see what it was and his heart stopped. He had made a mistake. The bears in the tree were actually cubs and were being supervised by their mother, the very large bear that was currently staring at him from 80 feet away. She had heard her cub cry out, and upon spotting Jordan, assumed the cry to be his fault. He knew that he was in a lot of trouble. She began walking towards him and then running straight towards him. Although he had been trained on how to react to grizzly bears and knew in the back of his mind that he should play dead, his natural instincts took over in the face of a 500-pound killing machine sprinting right at him. He turned and ran, knowing that he was only a short distance from his house and thought maybe he could get in the door before she mauled him to death. He was running for his life, and he knew that the next few seconds could determine the rest of his life, however long that may be. Just 10 feet from his door, the bear smacked him in the back with her huge paw, and he was sent flying onto the ground. He was winded by the impact and barely had any time to register what was happening to him as he tried to stand up again. Immediately, the bear jumped on him and grabbed him by his head, trying to crush his skull in her strong jaws. He was terrified as he knew there was no way he could overpower the animal. Suddenly, he felt his feet leave the floor as he was lifted by his skull into the air. He thought he must be done for. The force was too much for his skull, and a large part of his scalp was ripped off, the pain blinding Jordan as he fell to the floor, blood gushing everywhere. He thought he could maybe crawl away as the bear was now holding his scalp in her mouth, so he was hoping she would just leave. He was wrong. After throwing Jordan's scalp aside, the bear began mauling his whole body. She tore off his ear and began to rip apart his chest, seemingly taking the cub's fall personally against Jordan, and it was like she had decided that he had to pay for the pain of her cub. He knew that his time was running out as the animal was not showing any signs of slowing down, seemingly determined to mercilessly tear him apart. He realized that he was not going to be able to wait it out or hope that she would leave, and in that moment, he remembered some of the training that he had been given in the past for this exact situation. He began to punch her in the head with as much strength as he could, which just further angered the bear. She flipped him onto his side to get his fists away from her and continued her attack. He quickly started kicking her in the eye with his heel, adrenaline increasing his strength, even though he had now lost a significant amount of blood. The bear started to back away a little, confused by the sudden rebuttal attack, and this gave Jordan enough time to pull himself to his feet again. After a second, the bear charged at him again, planning to end the fight once and for all. Jordan tried to punch her once again, this time aiming for her nose, but she managed to dodge his fists. As he continued to punch at the bear, he was able to slowly back away into his house and shut the door, waiting for the attack to continue. He knew that this door was only thin and the animal would easily be able to break it down with just a few body slams, but nothing happened. He waited for the crash of the bear entering the house to finish the job, but she never did. Instead, she just walked back into the forest, returned to her cubs, and left the scene. Although Jordan was thankful that the bear had now left him alone, he was now faced with another problem: surviving his extensive injuries. He lived in the middle of nowhere, he didn't have phone service, who would he contact for help? He had no choice, he had to save himself. He managed to grab his car keys from upstairs, the adrenaline from the attack slowly wearing off, but he knew that if he passed out, he would never wake up again. Holding his chest closed, he left the house without checking his surroundings, and the bear had reappeared. She started charging at him once again, but he managed to get into the car and drive away. He was praying that he would make it to the hospital, praying that he would be able to see his wife and daughter again. Amazingly, he survived the drive and made it to his local hospital, where he was immediately airlifted to the Vancouver hospital. He had to have many surgeries in order to save his life. His right ear had been torn off, half of his scalp was missing, he had several puncture wounds from where the bear had tried to rip him apart, and an umbilical hernia from the repetitive climb from the bear. He had a long recovery journey ahead of him, but he was just grateful to be alive. He counted his blessings that she hadn't caught him that final time as he reached the car, and accepts that the accident was fully his fault, as he shouldn't have risked his life just for some photos. He should have known better given his experience working with the bears, and recognized that the bears were cubs and kept an eye on his surroundings. Either way, he was lucky to survive and went on to have a full recovery, narrowly escaping his final affliction. Nestled in the far eastern reaches of Russia is a land of wild beauty and rugged wilderness, the Kamchatka Peninsula. Here, the earth boils and steams with hot springs and geysers shooting steam high into the sky. It is a place of raw power where the earth itself seems to be alive and breathing. It is also home to an array of wildlife, from the majestic brown bear to the elusive snow leopard, where they roam the land freely in harmony with the landscape. For those who dare to venture into its depths, the Kamchatka Peninsula offers an unforgettable experience, as the beauty of nature is on full display and the wilderness of the land can be felt in every breath. Vitaly Nikolayenko was one of Russia's best-known bear researchers to date. He had dedicated almost 30 years, which was approximately half of his life, to researching these majestic creatures. The 66-year-old was also a senior ranger in the Kronotsky Wildlife Reserve, where he constantly patrolled the wilderness to battle illegal fishing and hunting. It was during these patrols that Vitaly followed the enormous brown bears of the Kamchatka Peninsula while documenting their social, mating, and feeding habits. In the evening, he would return to his cabin, light the kerosene lamp, and then document nearly 800 bear contacts annually. His work turned into one of the most significant records of brown bear behavior ever made. As the years passed, Vitaly plunged into repeated encounters with bears. He got very close and personal with the bears, who seemed to not mind sharing their space with him. His personal favorite was a 6-foot male bear that he had named Krasavchik, which means handsome. He was fond of Krasavchik and at times would lie next to the beast as it took a nap. In December 2003, Vitaly had stayed on the reserve instead of leaving his home to celebrate the holiday season. He had stayed longer than expected while finishing up his research on why some of the bears had not yet gone to their dens. Being winter, the bears were supposed to have gone into hibernation, warmly tucked into a hollow tree or under the roots of a huge tree. It was a Friday, and Vitaly was sitting by the window in his cabin with his hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. Outside, the world was a frozen wasteland. The trees were heavy with snow as their branches bent low under the weight. He took a sip of his tea, savoring the warmth as it spread through his body. He felt the tension in his muscles begin to ease as a sense of calmness washed over him. He had just finished packing and was waiting for his flight out of the reserve. As he stared out at the snow-covered landscape, Vitaly felt a sense of peace. The cold and the silence of the winter seemed to soothe his soul, and for a moment, he could not help but picture the warm reception he would get from Tatiana, his wife, upon his arrival. Her laughter was music to his ears. Her voice and grace made his worries and cares fade away. He missed her. He sipped his tea, lost in thought, as the winter world unfolded before him. He watched as the snowflakes drifted lazily through the air, with each one a unique and delicate creation. It was as if he was seeing the world through new eyes, a new dimension. This filled him with a sense of wonder and awe. And then he saw him. It was Krasavchik. His furry friend was headed to the half-frozen lake to quench his thirst. To kill the boredom, Vitaly decided to follow his favorite bear down to the lake, where he was sure to capture some award-winning pictures and memories to last a lifetime. He geared up and took with him his camera, flare gun, and bear spray, just in case things got out of hand. The lake was less than a mile from his cabin, and so he was sure he would be back before his helicopter arrived. As he stepped out into the snow, he felt the air was crisp and cold with a sharpness that seemed to cut through to the bone. His breath was puffing out clouds and the landscape was eerily quiet, as if the Kamchatka Peninsula itself was holding its breath. But he was no stranger to the harsh elements of this area, so he soldiered on. The growl of his friendly bear quickly freed him from his thoughts. He tried to trudge through the snow-covered trail in order to catch up, but the snow was deep and his feet were heavy. But he was determined. He quickly put on his cross-country skis, which allowed him to effortlessly glide across the snow-covered trail. He could see the bear's paw prints still fresh in the snow and was determined to keep up with Krasovchik. He pushed himself to go faster, his muscles strained and burned with exertion at the effort of pushing himself to the limit. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones, but he did not falter. He tightened his coat around him. The trail wound its way through the trees and he followed it cautiously with his senses heightened by the knowledge that a bear was nearby. Moments later, he saw Krasovchik. There he was in a grove, sleeping soundly. His usually brown fur was now gleaming in the winter sunlight. This was going to be the perfect picture as a reward for his turmoil in the harsh weather. Vitaly took out his camera, but taking a clear picture was impossible as the snow-covered branches and tree trunks kept getting in his way. He then made the risky decision to get inside the grove. He took his skis and stuck them vertically in the snow, got down on all fours, and then crawled, ducking and weaving through the tight spaces as he made his way through the branches. His eyes were fixed on his friend Krasovchik and his senses alert. He could hear his heavy but rhythmic breathing as he struggled to make his way through the pouring snow. The sound was almost peaceful, a big contrast to the natural ferocity of the bear. His chest rose and fell with each inhale, and with each exhale, a small plume of steam escaped from his nostrils, dissipating into the chilly air. It was a sight that melted Vitaly's heart. At about 3 meters from the sleeping bear, Vitaly took out his camera, ready to capture the beautiful scene for his memory book, as he had done numerous times before. On Saturday, the following day, the helicopter arrived, ready to airlift Vitaly out of the reserve for his holiday. The pilot found packed bags and a cold cup of tea by the cabin's window, but Vitaly was nowhere to be seen. He without hesitation called the search and rescue team, which arrived promptly and began searching. They followed Vitaly's ski trail, and just about a mile from the cabin, they found his skis at the entrance of the grove, placed vertically in the snow, just as he had done the day before. The rescue team then followed Vitaly's tracks into the grove, and just about 3 meters in, there he was. Vitaly's body lay there motionless. His bear spray can was empty, which led the rescue team to believe that he had used it to try to save his life. In the snow, they could see Krasovchik's tracks where he leapt to attack Vitaly. It seemed that the spray hadn't deterred the bear from attacking him. On his right side lay the unfired flare gun, which was half eaten. His camera lay inches away from his body. It was bloody and broken. The search and rescue team brought his lifeless body back from the wilderness for goodbyes and burial from his family. Despite his numerous research journals, Vitaly's proactive approach of monitoring bears was broadly criticized by the conservation movement community, who argued that he went against the consensual passive method of ethology. In his defense, Vitaly claimed that he never underestimated the tenacity of the bears, but this wasn't how his critics saw it. As to them, his death seemed to be a confirmation of their worries. In addition, in excess of over 20 bears that had become habituated in the presence of Vitaly were easy targets for poachers and were killed just before and shortly after his death. As it is with nature, wild animals are just that, wild. One shouldn't get too comfortable when approaching wildlife, as their wild traits are intrinsically imprinted in their genetics, and they can snap at any time, leaving behind a lifeless body. For Vitaly, this was a lesson learned a bit too late, but his journals shall forever be a constant reminder of his contribution to the science and academic community. He was a great loss to both man and nature, and the very animal he based his life around ultimately led to his final affliction.
Michio Hoshino was born in 1952 in Ichikawa, Japan. As a teenager, he developed a passion and enthusiasm for wildlife photography. He was particularly eager to spend time in Alaska, having bought a photography book in which the village of Shishmaref was photographed. At the age of 19, he wrote to the village's mayor and received a reply 6 months later inviting him to visit. From that moment on, his career as a nature photographer was set, and he became one of the most accomplished photographers of his era, often being likened to the world-famous Ansel Adams. But tragically, his love for wildlife photography and the career path his skill and flair had paved for him led to a fearsome encounter that shook his family, friends, and colleagues. As a boy, Michio loved exploring the wilds of Japan. He was an adventurous individual who was captivated by the natural world around him, but also an avid reader of a range of different book genres. His love for storytelling and, ultimately, writing was a big part of his career as a wildlife photographer. At the age of 16, he traveled solo across North America. He visited all the big cities and the wonders of the likes of the Grand Canyon. When he returned to Japan, he attended Keio University, graduating in 1976 with a major in economics. It was during his time there that he came across the grainy photo of Shishmaref that sparked his interest in Alaska. He wanted to know how the tiny community survived in such a bleak and inhospitable environment. He had so many questions, which is why he penned a letter and simply addressed it to Mayor Shishmaref, Alaska. During one of his university summers, he spent 3 months in the Eskimo village, living with a family and getting stuck into their way of life there. He returned to the state to study wildlife biology at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks. He had secured some work experience with a professional photographer and put his own photography skills to the test. He would venture off to the remote Alaskan wilderness in pursuit of the perfect shots. He documented his ventures in numerous essays. He had a unique ability to bring his storytelling to life, and through it and his photos, he brought the natural world of Alaska to people in all corners of the planet. His work soon earned him prestigious awards, and it was showcased all over the world. But his final photo, or at least what was believed to be his final photo, became one of his most famous yet. It was August 1996, and Michio had been assigned to work on the filming of a documentary about brown bears. He left his wife, Naoko, and his son, Shoma, in Alaska and set off for Russia. At that time, he and Naoko had been married for 3 years. The destination for Michio and the television production crew was Kurovskoye Lake, situated on the Kamchatka Peninsula, situated in the Russian Far East. The lake is a crater lake formed from the explosion or collapse of a volcano. It is surrounded by bush and trees, mostly alder, pine, and stone birch. Back in 1996, the lake, which is a nature reserve, was thought to have the highest population of brown bears in Kamchatka, and possibly even Russia. This was precisely why Michio and his team were headed there. They were guaranteed exceptional viewing of bear activity. The documentary they planned on filming was for a Japanese television station. The team's field guide, Igor Ravenko, who was a local expert, took the team to a known bear haunt. Rumor has it the guide knew of a bear that was unafraid of humans. It continued to fish in the crystal clear waters as people approached it. This was a photographer's dream. The team were able to capture unique and up-close footage of the animal as it continued to behave in its natural way, just feet from the cameras. But 2 days later, Igor, the guide, spotted some disturbing signs around their camp. Bear scat and markings were visible in and around it. When the team had been out in the wilderness, the bear had investigated their campsite. A chill ran down Igor's spine. Were they now the hunted? On August 8th, the production team had stopped work for the day and settled down in their cabin for the night. The cabin was full. and Michio opted to sleep outside in the tent. Igor advised him against it, knowing that the bear had already ventured into their camp and was unafraid of humans. But Michio insisted on staying in his tent. Not only did he prefer being closer to the great outdoors and having his own space, but he couldn't stand the sound of other people snoring. Being under canvas just yards from the cabin was a much better option for him and would ensure he'd get a decent night's sleep, or so he thought. The day had been long, and Michio quickly nodded off to sleep, warm in his sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of nature. But in the darkness outside, something stirred. It was a large grizzly bear that was prowling the surrounding woodland. It sniffed the air, the scent of the production team carried on the wind. It walked nearer, coming in for a closer look. Michio continued to sleep, unaware that his dreams were about to come crashing to an end. At 4 a.m., just before the milky haze of the dawn light, the bear sniffed outside Michio's tent. It snorted, and the vegetation under its heavy paws rustled the other side of the canvas. Its long snout was inches from Michio's face. He suddenly woke. The rustles, the deep-throated growling, and the loud sniffs had risen him from his slumber and had alerted him to the danger outside. He held his breath, listening and waiting. His mind was racing, and his heart began thundering in his chest. There was no way of alerting the others inside the cabin. All Michio could do was stay still and silent, hoping that the bear would lose interest and walk away. But the bear had other ideas. It had smelt something inside the tent, Michio himself. Suddenly, it slashed through the canvas with its front paws. There was nothing to protect Michio from the beast. It was in predatory mode, intent on securing its prey rapidly. Michio cried out in alarm and kicked at the face of the bear as it lunged through the canvas. His screams were heard by his colleagues in the cabin. Their guide, Igor, heard the commotion unfolding outside. It was 4 a.m. He opened the cabin door to see the back end of an enormous grizzly sticking out of Michio's tent. The bear was mauling the photographer, and Igor shouted, "Tent! Bear! Tent!" Everyone leapt out of their beds and ran outside. Michio was putting up a fight, but the bear bit down on him repeatedly, tearing flesh and biting into bone. He was powerless in the mighty beast's jaws. It shook its head from side to side, and Michio was thrown around like a rag doll. His colleagues were just 10 meters away. The tent had collapsed under the bear's weight, and underneath the canvas, Michio was grappling with the grizzly. Immediately, Igor grabbed a metal bucket and a spade. He ran towards the dilapidated tent and the ensuing attack, hitting the two items together. They crashed and banged in the night, the metal on metal ringing in their ears, but by the illumination of their flashlights, the bear didn't even flinch. Instead, it tugged and pulled at Michio, dragging him from his sleeping bag and into the dark, cold night. The others shouted at the animal, but it was in vain. It dragged Michio into the woodland and out of sight. His cries died down, and his friends knew that he had likely succumbed to his injuries, but in the darkness, they couldn't see anything. They had to wait until first light before they could track him down. They found his body in the woodland. It was a devastating finding and traumatic for those involved. The attack had happened so quickly and was thought to have been an exceedingly rare predatory attack. The noise from those who witnessed the attack and tried to intervene didn't deter the bear as it normally would. As news spread about the terrible incident, a photograph emerged on the internet and went viral. It was a disturbing image, and the caption claimed that it was the last photo Michio had taken on his camera. In the photo, an aggressive grizzly bear peers in through the open door of a tent. It's a terrifying image showing the bear's long canines and dominant stance, apparently seconds before it launched its attack on Michio. But it is, in fact, a fake. The lighting on the animal is different from that on the tent. Outside is broad daylight when the attack occurred at around 4 a.m. Although Russia's north does experience daylight nights, in August on the Kamchatka Peninsula, sunrise is between 5:30 and 6:30 in the morning. It was found that it was a Photoshopped photograph which was entered into a competition called Worth 1000 Photoshop. It was entered under the category entitled Hoax Last Photo Taken Before Death. Those who knew Michio only had the nicest things to say about him. He was an incredibly humble and modest man. When meeting somebody new for the first time, he would ask them about their story and listen intently, rather than talking about himself. In 1992, he founded the Aurora Club, which gives youths in Japan the chance to experience Alaska. His hope was that it would enrich their lives just as it had for him. Now, 3 decades later, the club is still running, and Michio continues to inspire the younger generation, as his photos and written works are still used throughout Japan today, such as in school textbooks. Michio was missed by so many that 12 years after Michio's death, his life was commemorated at Halibut Point State Recreation Area, just north of Sitka. Woodcarver Tommy Joseph carved a totem pole out of a red cedar tree. Depicted in it was Michio at the bottom, holding his beloved camera, and above him were the animals he loved to photograph, a fitting tribute to an inspiring man who left this planet too soon after meeting his terrifying final affliction.
It was August 20, 2012. Leila Rodriguez and Ethan Cruz eagerly boarded the Spitsbergen to Victoria cruise, brimming with anticipation for the journey ahead. As nature lovers and avid adventurers, the couple had been planning this trip for months. This was their grand vacation trip just before they got married in December of that year. The majestic Arctic loomed before them, promising a feast for the senses with its incredible views and the chance to witness some of the planet's most remarkable creatures up close. The couple was excited as they eagerly scanned the icy waters for any sign of life, hoping to catch a glimpse of the region's famed whales, seals, and polar bears. The tourists were left spellbound as the cruise pulled up to the shores of Ketavoya, offering up a front-row seat to one of the most awe-inspiring sights on the planet. The massive Kvitøy-Jakulen ice cap stood before them like a titan, leaving them breathless. As Leila and Ethan disembarked from the boat and stepped onto the icy shores, their senses were overloaded by the raw beauty of the landscape around them. The other tourists began taking pictures. Leila and Ethan exchanged a look, both silently acknowledging that they would carry this moment with them for the rest of their lives. Unfortunately, it would be memorable in ways they couldn't have imagined. For the visitors, the island was the ultimate natural spectacle, a chance to bask in the glory of the Arctic's unparalleled flora and fauna. But as the tourists soon discovered, this was no ordinary zoo. The animals here were wild and untamed, free to roam the icy expanse at will. To get their perfect shots, some of the tourists began getting too close to the animals. Leila and Ethan caught sight of a group of seals basking on the icy shores in the distance. With a sense of childlike wonder, Leila and Ethan slowly made their way toward the seals, careful not to startle them. As they drew closer, they couldn't help but feel awed by the beauty of the creatures. With the both of them equipped with DSLR cameras, the two began taking pictures of the seals. Leila and Ethan's eyes were glued to their camera screens, their fingers clicking away as they tried to capture the perfect shot of the seals. They were so absorbed in the task at hand, they didn't hear the commotion behind them. It was only when other tourists and tour guides began shouting, their voices raised in alarm, that Leila and Ethan realized something was wrong. At first, they thought it was just excitement, a reaction to the seals they captured on film. But as the shouting grew louder, they turned to see the other tourists frantically pointing somewhere behind them. Puzzled, Leila and Ethan scanned the horizon, searching for the source of the commotion. But it wasn't until they turned around and saw the polar bear lurking, its massive form camouflaged by the ice and snow. The sight of the massive polar bear just a few meters away was enough to freeze Leila and Ethan. Their minds struggled to make sense of the surreal, terrifying situation unfolding before them. The tourists and tour guides made a desperate effort to scare off the bear with loud noises and shouts, but the creature was undeterred. Eventually, Leela panicked and broke away from Ethan, her mind consumed by fear. It was a grave mistake. The moment she started running, the bear's predatory instincts kicked in and it chased Leela. The creature's eyes were fixated on Leela as she desperately ran for safety. However, she was no match for the speed and power of the bear as the creature closed the distance between them within a few seconds. Ethan followed the bear, attempting to scare it, but by then the creature had already lunged at Leela, knocking her violently to the ground. Because Leela was turned away from the bear, it grabbed hold of her head and bit mercilessly at her skull. The tourists were shocked at the horrific event unfolding. They slowly approached the bear, arms raised, and made as much noise as they could. One of the tour guides, who was armed with a pistol, began shooting at the bear, grazing the creature. He was hesitant not to hit Leela in the scuffle. However, the threat of bullets did not seem to stifle the bear. It continued mauling Leela as she screamed in agony. Ethan tried throwing stones at the creature, but none of them seemed to affect it. Nobody had time to react, as everything happened within a few seconds. Eventually, the creature began gnawing at Leela's face, and she could feel the teeth puncturing through her eye socket. Soon, her screaming stopped, and she began to lose consciousness. The tour guide then shot several more rounds at the bear's shoulder, finally inflicting enough damage on the massive creature to make a difference. The bear stumbled back and eventually succumbed to its injuries. Ethan rushed to Leela's side. She was badly mauled, but she was alive. The tour guides immediately called for help, and within a few minutes, a helicopter arrived. The paramedics airlifted Leela to a nearby hospital, where she had to undergo emergency surgery. The bite on the back of her neck was the most severe of her injuries, as the bear had missed her vertebrae by mere centimeters. Luckily, she survived the ordeal and made a full recovery. Surprisingly, Leela did not hold any grudges against the bear. "They were only doing what nature intended them to do," said Leela in an interview. However, she needed time to process her trauma and would stay away from the outdoors for a while after her tragic run-in with the powerful polar bear.
Richard White picked up an old camera at 15, and ever since then, he was hooked. Photography was his passion, and it's what drove him to learn how to rough it out in the wild. Before that camera, he'd never shown any inclination toward camping, hiking, or anything to do with nature. But that lens made the world come alive in a way that he'd never seen before. He never intended to make a living from it, but the passion kept him tethered, his mind healthy, and his mundane job at a pharmaceutical company bearable. As long as he could look forward to a camping trip planned on his calendar at all times, he was happy. Now at the age of 49, he'd long since graduated from going with hiking groups and camping with friends. He was happy enough to set out alone and disappear into the wilderness for a few days by himself. His wife and teenage daughter had gotten used to his absences every few months. Lucy, who was now 15, had started showing an interest in the lens too, and though she accompanied her father on short day trips around their home in San Diego, this trip wasn't one of those. Richard was going to Alaska's Denali National Park, and this 3-day expedition was a little too much for Lucy just yet. Not that Richard minded, he had a special place in his heart for Denali. He'd been there 3 times before, and to him, there was nothing quite like the silence and the beauty of the Alaskan wilderness. This was also his last chance to visit the place before the deep Alaskan winter set in, leaving snow so deep that sections of the park closes down completely. September and August were the best times to come anyway. The animals scurried about in a last attempt to store food for the long winter ahead, and to eat whatever greenery was left before the frozen wasteland took the last edible morsels away. Everything living was out and about, the bears, lynxes, bucks, squirrels, and everything. just waiting to be captured for eternity on Richard's memory card. Richard kissed his wife and daughter goodbye and set out for Denali. When he pulled in, he picked out a spot to erect his tent and loaded everything inside, his food, sleeping bags, and all. He wasn't planning on spending much time at the camp. The next 3 days he was going to be out taking pictures until the sun went down. The drive had been a long one, and he barely had enough time to get his tent set up before it got dark, but he still managed to take a few snaps of the sunset at least. The next morning, Richard wolfed down breakfast and set out with his camera around his neck and his backpack full of snacks and drinks. The morning began just as he'd planned. As the sun rose, the wilderness came alive. Both small and large animals came out in hopes of getting their paws on as much food as they could in a single day. By the time the afternoon came around, Richard settled next to a river beside a clump of willows for a bite to eat. Before long, a buck came out of the trees for a drink of water. Then the birds rose from the trees, and even a massive moose made an appearance. Richard knew that if he camped out here all day, he'd get more footage than most other places in the park. But he never expected to catch a glimpse of the majestic grizzly bear. To Richard's absolute delight, a half-ton male lumbered out of the thicket of willows. He headed straight for a clutch of berry bushes just 60 feet away from where Richard was sitting and began to pick them off with a surprising amount of finesse for such a large animal. As it picked the bush clean, Richard snapped one picture after the other, and he just couldn't believe his luck. The animal was now only 40 feet away, and still blissfully unaware of Richard's presence. Richard assumed that it saw him the moment it came out of the trees, but that it was choosing to ignore him, sitting so still in the distance. He'd run across bears from time to time, and they'd always preferred to keep their distance all on their own. But when this specimen of a bear came into the 40-yard range, Richard became a little unnerved. He'd never been so close to a bear before, and he doubted that it would come so close to him voluntarily. But now Richard was stuck where he was. He didn't want to move and startle the creature, fearing that could set off an unprovoked attack. So he remained where he was, continuing to take pictures and hoping that it would venture off on its own when the bushes were finally cleared of food. Richard was right to be worried about the small distance between them. He made a slight adjustment to get his legs in a more comfortable position and accidentally crushed a cereal bar wrapper beneath his foot. The sound made the bear look up, just as Richard snapped a shot of it looking straight into the camera. It saw Richard and tentatively moved toward the strange creature that was so close. Another picture, this time only 35 yards away, and another at 30 yards. Then Richard's blood ran cold. It wasn't coming in to investigate anymore. The bear was now running straight at him. He dropped his camera, left his bag, and began to sprint toward the water. It was the only place to go. There was no outrunning the pounding paws behind his back. At least in the water, Richard might be able to swim faster than the bear. The sound of the bear's pounding paws behind him was now accompanied by the deep huffing of the massive animal's lungs. It was closing in. Richard pumped his legs harder than he thought was possible. He didn't take the time to look back. He knew it was nearly on top of him. The pounding and the breathing was now accompanied by an earth-shattering growl, and then his legs folded beneath him as half a ton of pure murderous rage descended on top of him. It was only then that Richard uttered his first scream. At the exact same time, the bear's enormous claws ripped through his jacket. The grizzly began tearing at his flesh and raking him across the ground in a full-blown attack. The birds took flight from the reeds as Richard's screams punctured the air. No longer satisfied with clawing at the man's back, the animal picked Richard up and threw him over, spinning him through the air. Richard's torn-up back hit the dirt. Before he could even comprehend what to do in this life-threatening situation, the bear was on top of him again. This time, a set of nails grabbed his head, tearing through his scalp and cheek, and its jaws clamped down on his neck and shoulder. Richard's neck broke almost instantly. He had a quick flash of the most blinding pain he'd ever experienced in his life before the world went suddenly dark and Richard was no more. In a lot of ways, Richard was lucky. At least his death was relatively quick, and he wasn't aware of the next 15 minutes of hell his body went through. The grizzly continued to shake and tear at Richard's body. It ripped off his jacket and shirt, slashed at his abdomen, and almost entirely tore his scalp away from his skull. When the bear had finally expended all of its energy, it dragged Richard to a cache just 200 yards away, leaving a trail of insides that spilled out of Richard's torn abdomen. There, it buried him beneath the rest of the food it planned on eating over the next few days. Only 2 hours later, a group of hikers came upon Richard's discarded backpack, camera, shreds of clothes, and enough blood and gore to make the scene look like something out of a slasher movie. They ran 3 miles to the nearest station, and helicopters and rangers were deployed before the sun even began to go down. They only had to follow the bloody trail a short distance to find Richard's remains. But the bear guarding it posed a serious problem. It ran off into the woods when they approached, but darkening skies made visibility almost zero, and the shots that were fired all missed. So they returned the next day. From the air, they could identify 5 separate bears, but it was the one who kept coming back to the cache wanting to attack them that was deemed the culprit. It took 3 shots to down the 600-pound full-grown grizzly. The necropsy quickly determined that he was indeed the animal who had been feeding on Richard, but it was the camera that held the most chilling details. Though never released to the public, the officers described it as 5 final photographs of the animal becoming aware of its watcher, and for those 5 frames, looking dead straight into the lens of the camera, it came closer and closer and closer, capturing the few seconds before Richard White met his terrifying final affliction.